My remarks in the coming half hour or so are rather schematic and narrative, so I do not want to pretend that I am a specialist in either the historical or the philosophical themes I'm going to be touching upon. And so the depths of some of the topics I'm going to be touching upon, I'm really not, at least at this stage, in a position to expound or to bring any sort of original insight to. But this is kind of an old school humanistic endeavor. Everything is very well documented, but what I'm doing is bringing certain research themes into communication with one another, and hopefully some of the ideas that emerge will be of interest. Yes, so we're going to be just thinking a little bit about Leibniz's I Ching or Yi Jing, the book of Genesis, and the birth of binary code. We can begin just by remembering how extraordinary was the 17th century and early 18th century Jesuit mission in Imperial China. What we have on the screen is a description by the Kangxi Emperor, the longest serving emperor in the history of China. He reigned for 61 years. But this is a text by the Kangxi Emperor remembering his time with the Jesuits in his court in Peking and elsewhere in China. And he begins by talking about the Treaty of Nerchinsk, which had just been signed with the Russians. This is not strictly relevant to our topic, but I want to tell you a little bit about the Treaty of Nerchinsk because it feels a little contemporary, and it also is of intellectual historical interest. It's contemporary because, of course, it marks a couple of things. It marks the first international legally, it marks the first treaty that China signed with any other terrestrial power on terms which would now be recognized as reflecting the norms of the Roman and European international legal tradition. So China did not sign this treaty with Russia as the bearer of the mandate of heaven, but as one sovereign empire relating to another set of sovereigns. So this is interesting, and it was due to the Jesuit influence that China deigned to represent itself as one nation among others on the earth. But it's also just unbelievably fascinating that Latin, the Treaty of Nerchinsk was drawn up in Manchu copies and Russian copies and Latin copies. And so the Russians gave a Russian copy to the Chinese, and the Chinese gave a Manchu copy to the Russians. But the binding copy between them, which was drawn up by the Jesuits, was a Latin. So the first alliance that China, or treaty that China ever formed with any nation was in Latin. I find that rather extraordinary in and of itself, but of course it takes on a certain topical interest because, as we all know, China and Russia are closer today than they have been in quite a while. But that is not the first time that China and Russia have been close. Okay, so after the Treaty of Nerchinsk is signed, the Emperor Kangxi recalls he ordered a number of treatises to be composed in Manchu, including a translation of the geometry of Euclid. And we note here, I know this doesn't interest you at all, but note among the names of the Jesuits in the third line, we have one guy named Bouvet. Bouvet is going to become important. He is the man, as we'll hear in a few minutes, he's the man who sends Leibniz a Latin copy of the I Ching. Anyway, Bouvet and others are involved in this extraordinarily erudite imperial culture in Peking. Of course, we have a Flemish Jesuit here, Verbiest, who is instructing the Chinese in the modern science of forging cannons. He's also building a water fountain that operates in conjunction with an organ. these kind of like musical fountains or something that anyone who knows about 17th and 18th century royal architecture will be quite familiar with in Europe. Clocks and mechanics. But honestly, what I find most charming is that the emperor is taught by a Portuguese Jesuit, Pereira, to play his favorite Chinese tune on the harpsichord, which is what we see at the end of this quote. So this is, by the way, this is a Chinese, contemporary Chinese depiction of the Kangxi emperor as a young man. And here we see a European depiction of the Kangxi emperor. And this is the image here is actually taken from the frontispiece of a book by Leibniz called The Newest Things Out of China, which he published in the early 18th century. And here, the text on the screen, we have Leibniz telling us the sign I should really have placed on my door is Bureau of Address for China. He says, anyone who writes to me will learn some news about the nation of China. If you want to know about the great philosopher Confucius or other kind of more speculative matters, or even the newest things, Leibniz says he was the man in Europe you could go to learn about the cultural legacy and indeed the politics and the culture of China. So I've called Leibniz one of Europe's best informed China watchers, as we now say, avant la lettre. He was really fairly obsessed with the Far East. And as we'll hear in a few minutes, this interest has led to some curious places. What we have here is a depiction of Athanasius Kircher, and I just want to use this slide to remind us that one of the curious things that happens in the Renaissance, which leads to the early Enlightenment period, is the Renaissance fascination with Egyptology, Egyptian Hermeticism, which I think all of us are familiar with, the fabulous, the kind of canonic work of Francis Yates on this stuff, which has led to much further work. But what I did not know until quite recently is that the Egyptological fervor of the Renaissance linked up with early sinology in the early Enlightenment period, and what both of these kind of cultural engagements had in common was that Europeans were faced with immensely rich, highly developed language systems which were radically different from alphabetical writing. And so what both writing systems help Europeans, a question that both writing systems help Europeans to pose is, what is the origin of writing? And this is, of course, connected to one of the generic questions. I say that in the strict sense, the generic questions, one of the themes of Enlightenment philosophy, which is also what is the origin of language as such? And origin of writing is kind of both linked to and a subset of the question of the origin of language. And I want to express my debt. Basically, this entire talk, I do, as I say, I put much more recent research in conversation with Eco, and I make a certain number of moves which are not found in Eco's text, but my entire talk today is inspired by Umberto Eco's really marvelous 1993 work on the search for the perfect language. And of course, when Europeans begin to ask, what is the origin of language, what is the origin of writing, the Ur mythos, or the Ur history, depending on who you ask in this time and place, of all European peoples, is that the Garden of Eden is the place where language begins, and it is a place in which, according to the mythos, the divine being or beings, Elohim, depending on the passage you're reading, and humans can communicate with one another, which seems to imply that humans, at the beginning, humans had a perfect language. So the search for a perfect language is also recherche. It's an attempt to recover. It's an attempt to re-find something we have lost. And Eco does a brilliant job of showing that. And he shows how two particular combinatorial projects, one by the medieval apologist and mystic Ramon Lull, and the second by the early Enlightenment polyhistor, unbelievable intellect, Leibniz, how they are both related in different ways to the search for the perfect language. And of course, we'll all know that one of the great answers, one of the defining answers of the question, what is the perfect language, is going to be mathematics. I mean, the mathematical turn in modern philosophy, in modern natural science, and so on and so forth. What exactly makes mathematics a perfect language is a question others are much, including Leibniz, are much more capable of discussing than I am. But all I want to do with this slide is to remind us that if we say, to whatever significance we might give it, if we say that mathematics is the perfect language, then we also have the question, how is this perfect language to be notated? Which brings us back to Chinese and Egyptian writing systems. Okay, so you have a language, but what is the best way to notate the language? And what we see here, this is a manuscript of Leibniz's in which he begins to work out binary notation. Binary notation is a system in which all numbers can be notated only using the integers 0 and 1, the digits 0 and 1. But what we see in the text I printed out for you is that Leibniz begins with the fact that there is not only one way of notating mathematical numbers. One system, the one that we are used to, uses a base of 10. So you begin with 0 and work up to 9, and then 10 follows on naturally from that, and so on and so forth. But you can also use a base of 4, which is what we see in the second paragraph. You can denominate all numbers only using 0, 1, 2, and 3. And this is crucial for us. Leibniz is the first, what we see here in 1696, he is the first to say that the simplest way to denominate all numbers, and this is crucial, this is why we're going to be talking about the I Ching in the book of Genesis. It's not only the simplest way, but it's the one most in keeping with the nature and origin of numbers, is to begin again when we reach 2. Thus, there's only need for 2 digits, 0 and 1. All you need in order to describe the perfect language, which is the language one way or another that God has informed the world, the only digits you need are 0 and 1. Okay, so this is a very basic point. I could go on. I've looked into this a fair bit. Eco himself says that Leibniz's binary notation anticipates what was to become the language of computers. Strickland and Lewis, whom I just quoted, say, in proposing to mechanize binary arithmetic, Leibniz was digital computing's ultimate progenitor, and they cite a number of modern digital computing's founding figures in terms of engineering. It is widely recognized that when Leibniz begins to say that binary notation is not only the simplest way, but the way most in keeping with the nature and origin of number itself, when Leibniz begins to do this, he is setting in train a set of changes which ultimately lead to digital computing, and in very complicated ways as well. of course, to AI. So although Leibniz had already begun to experiment with binary notation, and we have many manuscripts showing that this is the case, it was only in 1701 that he was sent a Latinized copy of the I Ching by the Jesuit Joachim Bouvet, whose name I've already mentioned. Bouvet was sent to China by King Louis XIV. He arrived in Peking in a rather important year in European history, 1688. And then he actually returned to France around 1700, bearing 40 volumes from the Kangxi Emperor for the Europeans to consult. And one of these was the I Ching, which Bouvet sent to Leibniz. Why? Because Leibniz was renowned as a China watcher throughout Europe. And so what we have here is, in fact, the copy of the I Ching, which was sent in 1701 by Bouvet to Leibniz. Now, what Leibniz notices about this structure is very interesting, and it has already, in a sense, been predicted by what I told you about his fascination with the need only for 2 digits to describe all things mathematical. Because what he notices here is that the structure of the 64 hexagrams, which make up the basis of the I Ching, the structure is binary. All we have here are broken lines and unbroken lines. And the 64 hexagrams of the I Ching, all of their differences are inscribed simply by varying the number and the position of broken and unbroken lines within the hexagrams. And Leibniz says, well, surely what the I Ching is doing here is describing all possible situations, which is what the Book of Changes, the Yi Jing, the Book of Changes, is actually meant to allow us to see the sort, as we're going to see in a moment, the sort of propensities and logics which underlie all conceivable situations in history. And what Leibniz says is the means by which the I Ching is doing this is 0 and 1, the unbroken and the broken lines. So Leibniz begins to suspect that the I Ching exemplifies in extremely ancient Chinese form the kind of futuristic mathematical model, descriptive model, that he's working on in the 1680s and 1690s in Germany. And he thinks then that, again, the search for the perfect language is the research for the perfect language. It's the search to recover the perfect language. It's the research to recover knowledge that all humans originally had together, which ultimately, for Leibniz, has to do with the mystery of creation. And when Leibniz, there's one scriptural reference in this text, which we'll see in just a moment. It's not to the book of Genesis, and I'm not going to be talking, despite the title of the book of Genesis in my title, I'm not going to be talking about Leibniz's Genesis, hexameral philosophy, and I actually have not managed to find any sustained discussions of Genesis in Leibniz's text. But he certainly knew Genesis. And when he refers to the mystery of creation, he is referring to a particular Judeo-Christian interpretation of the first pages of the book of Genesis, and sometimes, depending on who you ask, of Plato's Timaeus, according to which creation occurs out of nothing, creatio ex nihilo, so having observed the binomial structure of the Latin I Ching, Leibniz then begins to think that the ancient Chinese themselves, in fact, preserve in the I Ching their knowledge of the mystery of creation. Now, what is the mystery of creation? The mystery of creation for Leibniz is that there is only one necessary substance, the infinite God, and all contingent substances have been created out of what? By the infinite God. Out of what? Out of nothing, out of zero. The mystery of creation is that all there is ultimately is 0 and 1. And so Leibniz begins to think that the mystery of creation, which is preserved to his mind by Christian tradition and in the Judeo-Christian canon, the mystery of creation is grounded in reason. Nevertheless, it is consciously unknown to pagan philosophies who tend rather to put matter and God side by side. Why? Because they do not understand how it is possible that everything could arise from one alone, and one alone is 1 and 0, because all that is with the one is 0. Yet at the same time, reason itself recognizes that essences or natures of things are comparable to numbers. This is why mathematics can be one kind of candidate for the perfect language. And with this, calculus is revealed quite wonderfully how all numbers are written with 1 and 0. This is a beautiful representation and provides an agreeable and lofty consideration of the unum necessarium, the one thing necessary. This is a reference to a famous scene in the Gospel of Luke where Jesus tells Martha that there is only one thing necessary. But what for Leibniz is the one thing necessary? What for Leibniz is the one thing that Europeans, he was a fan, we're not yet to this slide, but note the subtitle here, A Commerce of Light. This is, the phrase, A Commerce of Light, is Leibniz's phrase. He was a huge admirer of China, and he believed in what he called a commerce of light, an interchange of knowledge between the continent of Europe and the Chinese Empire, which he regarded as supremely civilized and impressive and capable of teaching the Europeans many things. But, so he wants a commerce of light, but the one thing necessary that the Europeans do have to teach, or rather to remind the Chinese of, is what we see at the bottom of this slide, namely how from God alone, as the most perfect and simplest one, and nothing else, 0, all other things arise. So the one thing the Europeans absolutely need to bring to the imperial court in China, which is accessible to reason but which has been forgotten, is that God has created all things out of nothing, and he believes that the binomial structure of the I Ching chimes with his attempt to create the binary notation of all mathematics, and that both of these together might help to persuade the Chinese that the mystery of creation is in fact not only accessible to reason, but is contained in their own most ancient documents. So basically, the ars combinatoria of the medieval mystic Ramon Lull, whom I mentioned earlier, was inspired by his desire to convert the Muslims of the Levant and North Africa. And many, many centuries later, the ars universalis of Leibniz is galvanized by his desire to convert the Chinese in the Far East. Now, it basically goes without saying that Leibniz was wrong about the meaning of the kind of the broken and unbroken lines in the Yi Jing. He was also wrong. I've mentioned a couple of times that Leibniz believed that the I Ching was ultra-archaic. It was a very, very ancient document. Modern scholars would argue that it only dates back perhaps to the 3rd century BCE. But one way or another, I'm nothing remotely resembling a specialist. I'm relying on the sort of texts we have on the screen. I've read a bit about this. But it does seem that the broken and the unbroken lines signify a rather well-known concept even in the West. Not a deeply known concept, but a familiar concept in the West, namely that of yin and yang. And I mention this because it seems to me that this is interesting in its own right, vis-a-vis the intellectual history of the I Ching and the history of digital computing. Whether we look at the zeros and ones of Leibniz's misinterpretation of the I Ching, or we look at yin, yang, and the mythic meanings that Chinese antiquity came to bestow upon the hexagrams of the I Ching, one way or another, which is, I hope, of interest to those of us gathered in this room and to the themes of Liliana's wonderful project, one way or another, these mythic meanings are connected to the origins of digital computing and AI. So the 0 and 1 of Leibniz, or the yin and yang of the I Ching, are in immensely complicated ways we're only beginning to glance at in these comments, are actually at the root of, or at least implicated in the birth of the sciences, the birth of the notations, the birth of the projects, which ultimately give rise to digital computing and AI. I think rather than getting into the monadology, I leave this here for those of you who are interested in reading it to do so if you like. This is just sort of metaphysical background for the mystery of creation as in Leibniz, as I've already described it. But I want to close with just a couple of thoughts, and I say original in the most modest sense. I only mean here by original that I'm not directly relying upon any other scholar, whereas heretofore I have been directly relying upon some of the literature I've tried to share with you. But it seems to me that there is a certain problem with the binomial, the perfect binomial language that Leibniz begins to sketch out, and which gave rise to such extraordinarily powerful systems, and that is that only machines can efficiently speak Leibniz's perfect language. So it is with Leibniz, it seems to me, that the perfect language ceases to be a quest for a human language and actually becomes, functionally speaking, the quest for an inhuman language. What, we might ask, does this tell us about modernity? What does this even tell us about the messiness and multiplicity of human languages in an age in which, of course, as we all know, there is something that with some precision could be called a mass extinction of natural languages, or at least the precariousness of natural languages in late modernity. However, I'm not going to develop that thought much further, but simply conclude by saying, however erroneous Leibniz's particular readings of the I Ching may have been, or indeed, according to some, his readings of the book of Genesis are equally erroneous. But however erroneous his various readings might have been, and however spectacularly effective his binary machine language of zeros and ones has been, surely we can conclude that machines, machine systems, machine languages will never answer Leibniz's fundamental question, which is indicated on the screen, and which comparative myth indicates is also one of humankind's fundamental questions, and that is, why is there something one rather than nothing zero? Perhaps then at the heart and root of all languages, machine and perfect, or human and imperfect, Asian or European, lies a great mystery that humans must take care at all costs to remember. Thank you.
First of all, thank you for a very, very provocative talk. I sort of came in here thinking I was going to ask one kind of question, but I'm going to ask a different one based on what you actually said. And this goes to the issue of the origin of language. And so I was thinking about the Garden of Eden. And I was thinking about, what is this original language, right, that everybody's talking about we've fallen from? And as I understand, it's really only with Rousseau and in the 18th century that the original language is thought of as a spoken language. Now imagine if the original language was telepathic, right? And what you get is, some image, ideational image in my mind, I can transmit to you in some way, and we can do that, and that becomes the commerce of light, right? And this explains a lot, I would say. So the thing that's really fascinating about the hieroglyphics and about the Chinese ideograms, right, is the fact that the concepts are visual, right? Whereas with the languages that the Latins and the Germans and all the rest of them are speaking, right, it's phonetic, right? And speech would only arise after the fallen state. But in the Garden of Eden, people are telepathic in terms of, so there is a literal language of thought that's going on, okay? So I think that's kind of what's going on in the background here, right? And why the commerce of light thing is so such a vivid thing for not just him, but for a lot of these people in the period, and why they like Neoplatonism and all that kind of stuff, right? Is this kind of idea that we really are literally talking about an original language that is in some sense telepathic. That's what I think, right? And it's only in the fallen state that then you start to get the discussion of the origin of language somehow going from speech to writing, right? And this is the kind of thing that Derrida in Of Grammatology deconstructs, right? It's that kind of story, from speech to writing, right? And why would you deconstruct it? Well, because maybe you have this other story in the back of your mind, which is kind of what's motivating Leibniz, right? Because Leibniz wants to find that language, right, which in a sense is visual and imagistic. And the thing about mathematics isn't just that you're going through mechanical procedures and stuff like that, but the fact is it's visual. I think the visual aspect of mathematics, in terms of capturing the elements, in that form rather than orally, I think is a very compelling kind of thing for him, right? And that in some way the perfection moves in that direction. And I don't know if you ever read this book that Ian Hacking published about 50 years ago now. Why Does Language Matter to Philosophy? You haven't read that? You should have a look at it. It's a short book. And he talks about different periods of the understanding of language that philosophers have gone through. And so he talks about the 18th century, and he's focusing mostly on Locke, the way of ideas, right? And the thing that Hacking, who is a linguistic philosopher, at least has that kind of bias coming into things, right, is very amazed about the sense in which, Locke seems to act as if, right, we can have, as it were, direct representations from nature in our minds, and that we can, and that language only forms a sort of subsidiary role because it all looks like it's kind of telepathic. And a lot of this stuff in the Enlightenment, had this kind of character prior to Rousseau. Okay, and so I would just put that on the table as something to think about, right? That in a sense, the attraction of hieroglyphics, and the Chinese, right, language has a lot to do with that kind of visual, that kind of idea of what the original language was like. And it wasn't a spoken language. This is the point. It wasn't a spoken language. Because as you know, with these ideographic things, right? You can have the same signs, but people speak them in different ways, right? Hence the difference between China, Japan, Korea, all the rest of them, right? So I think this is kind of the imaginary that's going on. It's that the original language was telepathic, you know, and you could take that for what it's worth, right? To go to the science fiction stuff, right? But I do so I do think there's a kind of literal conception of the language of thought that's involved in this project.
I mean, that's an amazing question, pointing in a lot of different directions, all of which are very much interesting to me. My only thought, it's a little like rather meager exegetical thought, but my only thought is it does occur to me that, and of course we could talk about the two creation narratives, you know, Genesis 1, Genesis 2 and 3, okay. But nevertheless, on the first page of the Hexameron, the 6 days' work of creation, we're told that God spoke.
Yes.
God speaks,
yes.
And things happen.
Yes.
But at least to my recollection, and this bears out at least part of what you're suggesting, at least to my recollection, when Adam names the animals, and by the way, Giorgio Agamben has a very nice little text on this, but when Adam names the animals, we're not told that he speaks, I don't think. We're told that he names them, but we're not told that he speaks. So God speaks. Adam, when he's alone with the animals, does not necessarily speak. But I do think when he's introduced to Eve, he speaks. This is when he has his hymn of love. But I would also be interested to look at the wording and maybe...
Yeah, what speaking means in this context.
Yeah. No, but thank you so much. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you very much. This was enlightening, to say the least. I didn't know really any of this. It really sort of goes very nicely. I mean, what I was saying in my talk, basically there are two sort of strands of science developing since the rationalism and empiricism, sort of a seeming dichotomy. There's a kind of a toolbox way of doing science where everything is kind of a tool for your, you know, scientific inquiry, and then the romantic understanding of science that really takes various big sort of phenomena or concepts as unities, as platforms. And now I'm pretty convinced. I suspected that Leibniz is the kind of a toolbox guy, and you know, this is precisely the argument in favor of that sort of a view, because this is the beginning of one thesis that until nowadays in science has been very kind of acute, and that's that natural phenomena are computable. And you know, he already sort of said what that means. It means that, you know, if you understand computation in this reductive way, it's, you know, 0, 1, there's, you know, electric power, electric charge or no charge, that, you know, it doesn't really matter how these sets of zeros and ones are going to unfold, you know that you can compute them. They are sort of a computational process. That's one strand. But then all these other people, until nowadays, their assumption is, or sort of they are trying to show that neither life nor mind are actually computable phenomena. You can, for some practical purposes, do that, reduce it into this binary form and compute it, but there are various reasons why this is not the case and cannot be the case. And one of the principal philosophical reasons why they believe that is that they think that the unity really is not just an individual, right? When you parse the world into zeros and ones, what you're doing, you're parsing it into sort of kind of clear-cut individuals, and you really need
monads.
Yeah, monads. You know, atomism of some sort, right? So you need well-distinguished, in some ontological sense, individuals to have that kind of the world. And the Romantics already, like even I would say, you know, with like Goethe and Humboldt and so on, they thought of the unity as something that really transcends ontologically individuation. And that the only thing you can do is kind of understand layers, hierarchies, relations, but individuation in that sort of sense is not really what you can achieve, precisely because of the starting point, that understanding the kind of the unity is very different from sort of computationally parsing the world into these sort of individuals. So Leibniz, for them then, deflated kind of the ontological sort of, or sort of lowered the bar of our ontological expectations.
He, at the same time, Leibniz was very critical of the mechanistic turn represented by Descartes. And he represents an attempt to reintroduce both souls to all living things. So he says that all living things are alive in a really essential way. But also entelechy, so final causality. And so I think it's a complicated picture. There's a very good book called Divine Machines. I think his name is Justin E.H. Smith, about Leibniz's theoretical biology. But he complicates the modern turn of the 17th century in ways which I find, at least arguably, so this is an alternate genealogy would be to say that Leibniz is the guy, by his insistence on entelechy, Leibniz is the guy who makes the third critique necessary. Leibniz is the guy who makes Kant still concerned with final causality. And it's Kant's third critique which makes romanticism both necessary and possible, or something like that. So at least I'm increasingly sympathetic to Leibniz, and I would want to see him as someone that we should not interpret reductively.
Thanks for wonderful talk. I'm Jack. So I have clarification. I think the Yi Jing exists before Confucius, because he asked people to read it. And tradition has it that people need to read Confucius' commentary on Yi Jing. Okay, so just a clarification. Now, I'm interested to know Leibniz's view about the basic use of Yi Jing, which is basically divination or fortune telling, right? Since Leibniz related this to Genesis, I don't know what his view about this fortune telling. So basically, in the ancient time, when a country fight a war, they will make use of Yi Jing to see what may happen or whether they should go into war, right? And then the metaphysical interpretation of Yi Jing is that for Confucius, there's no such metaphysical underpinning at that time. This metaphysical reading actually starts with the Taoism, Laozi. And then, but I think in the Song dynasty, around Aquinas period, and then we see the transformation of the Confucius interpretation. And then the something derived from nothing starts. Right? So I wonder how Leibniz evaluate the fortune-telling part of the use of Yi Jing. Yeah, thank you.
This is a wonderful question. Let me just begin by saying that as to the dating of the I Ching, I'm absolutely incapable of providing any sort of insight or precise comment whatsoever. I suppose, based on what I've read, and I could be mistaken, based on what I've read, it might be the sort of question of what form of I Ching, because in the slide we have here, the I Ching was written over a long period of time, mostly after Confucius, but the later Confucians and early modern Europeans all thought it came from a very early period. So it seems like this would be the sort of argument that you find with many ancient texts, that modern text critics and historians, whether one accepts their account or not, would be saying that, okay, the roots of the I Ching predate Confucius, but the I Ching that Emperor Kangxi had and the Confucians were reading, which they then handed to Bouvet, and he translated that I Ching, postdates Confucius. So whether this is correct or not, I'm not in a position to say, but this seems to be at least in Europe, some sort of scholarly consensus, that picture. As to the question of divination, I simply have to say that I'm not myself. My interest in Leibniz's reading of the I Ching has from the beginning been tied to this kind of binomial project and the rise of AI and so on and so forth. So I'm really not in a position to elucidate how he constructed the divinatory kind of purpose of the I Ching. I suppose this is a suggestion which is based on kind of background reading, and it might be incorrect. But precisely to the extent that someone like Leibniz might have thought the mystery of creation is contained within ancient documents, this is what the Jesuits were arguing, then he or some of the Jesuits he was corresponding with might very reasonably have argued that the divinatory use of the I Ching was a misuse of the I Ching, and that this was a process of kind of losing touch with and debasing the more primal, metaphysical, mysterious meaning of these ancient documents. But that's only a speculation at this point.